There are moments when nothing explodes, nothing collapses on camera, no alarms go off, and yet everyone who understands systems feels it at the same second. A pause that lasts half a beat too long, a sentence that lands without the expected reaction, a room that stops responding the way it always has. This was one of those moments. It didn't announce itself as a crisis. It arrived quietly, almost politely, disguised as another performance of confidence, another familiar ritual where power reassures itself that it still works. For years, the governing logic had been simple and brutally effective. Insistence replaces verification. Say something often enough, loudly enough, and the surrounding structures adjust. Markets hesitate. Institutions delay. Allies nod even when they know better. Reality becomes flexible, conditional, something that can be negotiated in public and enforced later through repetition. This approach doesn't require truth. It only requires momentum. And for a long time, momentum held. But systems don't fail when they are attacked. They fail when they are asked to do two incompatible things at the same time: to applaud and to calculate, to believe and to price risk, to perform loyalty while quietly preparing exits. And this is where something subtle began to fracture. High above the ordinary world, in a place designed specifically for affirmation, the ritual unfolded as expected. Bright lights, carefully arranged seating, familiar faces that usually play their roles with practiced discipline. The tone was supposed to be triumphant, the timing symbolic. A closing appearance meant to seal a narrative already written days earlier, before the background noise turned into something sharper, something harder to ignore. The words had been prepared for a calmer reality. The world, meanwhile, had moved on. At the same time, and this is important, elsewhere, mechanisms were shifting that do not respond to speeches. They don't listen. They don't wait. They don't care who is speaking or how confident they sound. They react only to pressure, to imbalance, to accumulated distortions that can no longer be rolled forward. These mechanisms were already in motion while the podium was being adjusted and the microphones tested. What made this moment different was not a single mistake or an obvious lie. Those are usually absorbed. What made it different was synchronization, a convergence of unrelated processes aligning in the worst possible way. Diplomatic theater unfolding against financial signals that were flashing warnings. Legal procedures advancing on their own timelines, indifferent to symbolism. Supply chains tightening quietly without statements or threats. Each of these, on its own, could have been managed. Together, they created something far more dangerous: a loss of narrative control. You could feel it before you could explain it. The atmosphere was wrong, not hostile, uncomfortable, not chaotic, strained. The kind of tension that emerges when people realize they may be sitting inside a story that no longer belongs to the speaker. That realization doesn't produce outrage. It produces calculation. Phones come out. Eyes drift away from the stage. Attention shifts from words to numbers, from posture to exposure. And this is where the main thing begins. Because power depends less on what is said than on whether others are willing to suspend their own judgments while listening. Once that suspension ends, even the strongest voice sounds thin. Even the most confident claim starts to feel like noise filling a gap that can no longer be closed. There were claims made that assumed the old rules still applied. That assumption itself was the risk. Normally, such claims are tolerated, corrected later through careful language and diplomatic phrasing. But tolerance has limits, especially when stakes rise and patience thins. When systems feel threatened, courtesy becomes optional. What followed was not an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic interruption. That would have been easier to manage. Instead, something colder happened, something procedural, something that didn't need explanation because it carried its meaning in its execution. Attention withdrew, presence dissolved. The visual confirmation that power depends on was quietly denied. At the same moment, signals from elsewhere began to intrude, uninvited, not rumors, not commentary, movements that carry consequences measured in billions, not headlines. The kind of movements that force institutions to act regardless of political preference. The kind that expose whether leadership understands the machinery it claims to command. Attempts were made to reassert control, to reframe what was happening as strength, as validation, as proof that everything was proceeding according to plan. But this is the danger zone. When interpretation lags behind reality, improvisation becomes a liability. Every additional word widens the gap. Every reassurance draws attention to the absence of response. Those who knew how to read the signs didn't need commentary. They understood what simultaneous stress across finance, diplomacy, and law implies. They understood that this wasn't about a single event going wrong. It was about alignment, and not the kind anyone wants. When different systems start delivering the same message independently, it usually means the buffer is gone. The room had changed, even if the speech had not. And once that happens, there is no way back using the same tools. Applause cannot be demanded. Confidence cannot be enforced. Reality, once it stops negotiating, does not announce its decision. It simply proceeds. And the most unsettling part wasn't what was visible. It was what hadn't happened yet. Because when systems begin to correct themselves in public, the visible moment is rarely the core damage. It's the signal that something larger is already underway, operating on timelines that no speech, no gesture, no performance can slow down. At that point, the story doesn't end. It stops responding. From that pause, the system moved forward on its own logic. Not emotionally, not politically, mechanically, and this is the part they usually keep quiet about, because once you see it, the illusion doesn't come back. Power at this level doesn't collapse when someone is exposed. It collapses when coordination breaks, when different subsystems stop trusting the central signal and begin acting defensively, each in isolation, yet all in the same direction. That is what was unfolding. Diplomacy disengaged first, not out of protest, but out of risk management. When words stop matching enforceable capacity, participation becomes a liability. Financial systems followed immediately, because they always do. They don't wait for confirmation. They price anticipation. Years of distortion had been sustained by cheap liquidity, predictable flows, and the assumption that someone, somewhere, understood the downstream consequences. But the moment that assumption falters, capital doesn't argue. It exits. Slowly at first, then all at once. This wasn't panic. Panic is noisy. This was recognition. The critical failure wasn't that markets moved. Markets always move. The failure was interpretive. Movement was mistaken for validation. Volatility was framed as enthusiasm. That misreading signaled something far worse than incompetence. It signaled disconnection. A leader reacting to symptoms without understanding cause is not steering. He's narrating while the machine operates independently. This is where the internal alarm goes off for institutions. Because if the person at the center doesn't grasp the coupling between Tokyo and New York, between bonds and credit, between liquidity and legitimacy, then every future statement becomes unreliable. Not false, irrelevant. And irrelevance at that level spreads faster than scandal. Legal systems, meanwhile, don't care about optics at all. They run on deadlines, filings, procedures that continue whether cameras are on or not. While symbolic authority was being asserted abroad, procedural authority was executing domestically, quietly, methodically. No speeches, no negotiations, just action. That contrast matters more than any accusation. One system was talking about control, another was demonstrating it. This is how structural weakness reveals itself. Not through outrage, but through asymmetry. One side performs strength, the other side enforces outcomes. Observers notice immediately which one actually shapes reality. What made this convergence especially destabilizing was timing. These processes were not coordinated by any single actor. That's the uncomfortable truth. No conspiracy is required. Systems drift until they collide. And when they do, responsibility becomes irrelevant. Effects compound regardless of intent. All of this unfolded while another layer tightened quietly: supply dependencies. These are levers that don't announce themselves until they are pulled. Energy, materials, transit routes, areas long treated as background assumptions suddenly become tools. When access is conditional, rhetoric loses weight. Threats invert. Silence becomes leverage. At this stage, internal cohesion becomes critical, but cohesion depends on confidence, and confidence depends on predictability. When responses lag, when explanations contradict visible outcomes, silence inside the system is no longer loyalty. It's calculation. Everyone starts running their own scenario analysis. Who absorbs damage? Who distances first? Who waits? This is the moment where the system usually fails, not publicly, internally. decision-making slows, messaging fragments, risk aversion replaces initiative. Allies stop asking what you want and start asking what happens if you're wrong. That question alone changes everything. Attempts to reassert dominance through escalation are common here. They often feel decisive. They rarely work. Because escalation requires credibility, and credibility depends on demonstrated control, not volume. When multiple subsystems are already signaling constraint, escalation only confirms desperation. What observers understood in real time was not humiliation, not even loss of stature. It was misalignment, a leader operating inside an outdated feedback loop while the environment had already shifted. And once that gap is visible, it doesn't close quietly. The dangerous part is that none of this feels dramatic from the inside. It feels like noise, like bad timing, like unfair treatment. But from the outside, the pattern is unmistakable. Systems withdrawing trust do not issue warnings. They simply stop compensating. And that's where the pressure continues to build, because what comes next is not about reputation or messaging. It's about consequences that unfold regardless of intention, regardless of denial, regardless of how convincingly confidence is performed. At this point, the machinery is still moving, but it's no longer aligned. And when that happens, the next phase isn't collapse, it's correction. This is where the timeline stops being theoretical, because once correction begins, it doesn't ask permission. It selects targets. It exposes limits. It forces choices that were postponed when momentum still covered mistakes. What matters now is not how this looks, but how it functions. Credit tightens first, because it always does. Not dramatically, not with announcements, but through conditions. Shorter terms, higher margins, fewer assumptions baked in. Access becomes conditional rather than automatic. When that happens, leverage flips. The party that once dictated terms starts reacting to them. Diplomacy follows the same pattern. Engagement becomes procedural. Statements replace coordination. Meetings happen, but outcomes stall. The absence of confrontation is not de-escalation. It's disengagement. That is far more damaging. Because once partners begin planning around you instead of with you, restoration becomes exponentially harder. Internally, the consequences are quieter but sharper. Decision makers begin hedging against their own leadership, not openly, through delays, through ambiguity, through careful phrasing that preserves optionality. This is how systems protect themselves when they sense instability at the top. Loyalty transforms into insulation. Supply pressures don't reverse on command. Once routes are diverted and dependencies reweighted, reversal costs more than adaptation. The map changes. And when the map changes, previous assumptions about power projection stop applying. Influence shrinks not because it is challenged, but because it is bypassed. Financial markets don't punish arrogance. They punish inconsistency. When messaging diverges from mechanics, volatility stops being noise and starts becoming signal. That signal spreads. Pricing models adjust. Risk committees meet. Exposure is reduced quietly. By the time it becomes visible, the decision has already been made. The most dangerous phase begins here, because this is where escalation feels tempting. When authority erodes, the instinct is to reassert it through force, economic, political, symbolic. But escalation without alignment accelerates isolation. Each move intended to demonstrate control instead confirms constraint. At this point, even success becomes fragile. Any short-term stabilization is interpreted as temporary. Any rebound is sold. Any pause is treated as opportunity to exit. Confidence, once broken at the system level, does not return through performance. It returns through predictability. And predictability is exactly what has been lost. What remains is a narrowing corridor, fewer viable options, shorter timelines, higher costs attached to every decision. The system is still functioning, but no longer forgiving. Errors that would once have been absorbed now propagate. This is the point of no return, not because collapse is inevitable, but because reversal requires concessions that were previously unthinkable. Structural adjustments, loss of autonomy, acceptance of limits, and those are the hardest moves for any power structure to make while still claiming dominance. The real outcome won't be decided by speeches, markets, or headlines. It will be decided by whether alignment can be restored faster than correction advances. That is a race few systems win once it begins. And the unsettling truth is this: nothing here requires catastrophe. It only requires continuation. The machinery is already running. The direction is already set. The only open question is how much friction it encounters before it finishes recalibrating everything around it. At this stage, the story doesn't resolve. It stabilizes into a new normal, one defined not by ambition, but by constraint. And systems rarely announce when that transition becomes permanent. They simply stop behaving the way they used to. Underneath all of this sits a deeper layer that rarely makes it into public discussion, because it forces an uncomfortable admission. Modern power is less about command and more about synchronization. When synchronization fails, authority doesn't disappear. It becomes expensive. Every decision requires more force, more incentives, more pressure just to achieve outcomes that once happened automatically. What began as a credibility fracture now migrates into institutional memory. Risk models are updated, diplomatic cables are rewritten. Contingency plans quietly remove assumptions that were once treated as fixed. These changes don't reverse even if personalities change. Systems remember instability far longer than voters do. Another consequence emerges here, often misunderstood. When leadership becomes unpredictable, alternative centers of coordination start to matter more. Regional blocs tighten internally. Bilateral agreements bypass larger frameworks. Currency arrangements diversify not as rebellion, but as insurance. None of this is ideological. It is procedural self-defense. This is how influence decays without confrontation. Not through defeat, but through redundancy. When others no longer need to ask, wait, or react, leverage evaporates. Power that must constantly announce itself is already compensating for something missing. Domestically, the feedback loop turns inward. Institutions designed to slow crises begin to stall under the weight of ambiguity. Legal authority, financial authority, and executive authority drift further apart. Each remains intact on paper, but coordination weakens. Decisions are technically valid, yet strategically misaligned. That gap is where long-term damage accumulates. There is also a psychological consequence that systems rarely acknowledge. Once elites stop believing that leadership understands second-order effects, they stop sharing bad news early. Information arrives later, filtered, softened, or incomplete. By the time it reaches the top, it is no longer actionable. This is how errors compound without anyone intending them to. At this stage, even allies begin to recalibrate language. Not hostile, not critical, cautious. Words become conditional. Commitments acquire footnotes. Timelines stretch. The tone shifts from certainty to manageability. These are not stylistic choices. They are signals. And here is the most revealing indicator. Attention moves elsewhere. Global focus is finite. When it drifts, it does not return easily. New centers attract capital, dialogue, and patience. Old centers become topics rather than participants. That transition is subtle but decisive. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that it feels survivable. There is no single breaking point, no dramatic collapse, just a steady increase in friction. Every outcome costs more than expected. Every move delivers less than promised. Over time, that erosion defines reality more than any crisis ever could. In the end, systems do not fail loudly. They downshift, they simplify, they reroute around inefficiency. And when they do, the loss is not sudden power, but future optionality. Paths that once existed quietly close. That is where this story truly sits. Not at the moment of embarrassment, not at the moment of shock, but at the moment when alignment slipped, correction began, and the system chose continuity over loyalty. Once that choice is made, everything that follows feels inevitable, not because it was planned, but because no one intervened in time.